Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We'll now be joined from Washington with Professor Nizar Farsakh, a professor of international affairs at George Washington University. Welcome, Professor. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
The pleasure is ours, sir. Now, we're hearing extremely direct threats from President Trump about targeting Iran's infrastructure, its bridges, and its power plants. How significant is this shift in rhetoric? Does it signal imminent escalation, or is this just strategic pressure?
No, I believe he is very frustrated. He was expecting results sooner, and at the same time, he's a person who actually believes in intimidation and the use of force. He believes in confusing his adversaries. So I would wager that what he's doing now is brinksmanship with the Iranian regime, telling them that he is willing to go the extra mile and just hit civilian targets in order to intimidate them into conceding, and we'll see if that's going to work.
Now, does this sort of rhetoric fall into his sort of madman approach, his sort of rule through chaos? If he's unpredictable, then whoever his opponent is cannot predict his next move, and this gives him a sort of advantage in this crisis, let's say?
It does and it does not. It's not chaotic as much as trying to communicate that he has no restraints, that he would stop at nothing, and therefore makes the other party scares the other party more because they don't know like what he would do. But as a negotiation tactic, it's actually pretty inadequate, let's say, especially in international politics, because the longer this war goes, the less credible all these threats become. He did threaten several times that he's going to do this or increase his attacks, but then goes back and says, "Oh well, we're going to negotiate." So his ability to keep using the same tactic makes it weaker.
Now, sir, I understand you have a background in international negotiations and settlement. Given the current phase that we're in this escalation, how does this compare to any previous negotiations over these conflicts, or is this sort of unprecedented in this case?
In general, like the saying goes that war is just an extension of diplomacy.
True.
In the end, each party is trying to achieve their goal, and they're using the tool that they think is going to be more effective. And that assessment depends on how they perceive and assess the other side. So it's clear that the U.S. administration had miscalculated this regime's capacity to keep control. They were expecting first with the demonstrations. They did not expect the regime to be that, to kill so many people, to be so ruthless. And then in the war itself, they expected with the decapitation that the whole regime would fall apart, completely underestimating how institutionally organized the regime is. I would say it is exceptional in that we've never had an American president who is doesn't have the political background or even historic knowledge of the region or of how politics is run. He's definitely a person who all his life has been a business person who even when he did mistakes, he didn't pay for them. He was bankrupt 4 or 5 times and was not impacted. So he genuinely does not understand how or the consequences of his actions because he's never had to pay them. So the way unlike other presidents and other politicians, he has a far bigger tolerance for failure and far bigger tolerance for expensive consequences, precisely because he never actually pays that price.
Now, sir, we saw very earlier on in this conflict the Omani foreign minister. He came out and he said that Iran was very close to accepting a very favorable nuclear deal uh, with the igniting of this conflict. How far back does this set the nuclear situation between the U.S. and Iran?
of course, very far back. It's one in negotiations. Trust is very important. But once you lose trust, it takes a lot to build trust. But once you lose trust, it becomes extremely difficult to gain it back again. And the experience that this Iranian regime, regardless of what we think of the regime, but the experience of this regime has had with this American administration has been very bad, and I don't see any reason why this regime would trust any negotiation with the Americans. I expect that they are, if there's an end to the war anytime soon and it goes to negotiations, they will insist on other parties being involved and having keeping some collateral, let's say, or some leverage, because they do not trust that the U.S. is going to keep its word.
Now, Professor, when a U.S. president is publicly speaking about destroying civilian infrastructure, how is that being read in Tehran? Is it sort of deterring them, or is it provoking a retaliation? We have seen their previous statements saying that there will be a sort of tit-for-tat strategy. Whatever you hit here in Iran, they will hit the similar facilities and infrastructure in the Gulf region. So does this deter? Is this sort of weakening Trump's hand? Is it the sort of, let's say, if you're a hammer, then everything looks like a nail to you, and that you have this one negotiating strategy?
Yes, and this regime loves nails, let's say. This actually works to the regime's advantage. They want to escalate to hitting civilian targets because, again, to be quite frank, they are better at it. And therefore, and they know that they have a much larger tolerance for pain than the Gulf states or Israel in that respect. So it would allow the Iranian regime to even pull no stops. So they want that escalation. They believe, the regime believes that that's going to give them the kind of advantage that will end the war sooner and to their terms, on their terms.
So, Professor, just as you said, this escalatory rhetoric, this sort of gives Iran the green light to just hit whatever it wants to hit. Does this not? What does this mean? The psychology of this decision making? Because with this rhetoric, he's basically saying you can escalate as far as you want. I will escalate even higher than that to sort of scare them into submission. But after an entire month, we've seen that this is not working.
Well, they think there are more targets to hit for sure. There is this. It's stemming from a perception, assessment of their own power and assessment of the power of the other side. The perception that the other side is unwilling to pay certain costs is in a sense accurate, because this regime is fighting for its life, literally, while the Americans and the Israelis are fighting for political gains and for an improved geopolitical situation. So there is far more willingness on the Iranian side to take casualties for that, while the other side is tolerance for casualties is going to be far less.
Now, Professor, we're hearing statements from President Trump such as the regime knows what has to be done. He's come out and said that this is a much softer regime than the previous one. Does this suggest that the U.S. is still pushing for regime change, or is this coercive diplomacy? Because over the last month, we've seen the goalposts and the objectives of this war shift and change constantly. So does this now bring the goal of this war back to regime change, or again, is this coercive diplomacy?
And I think this is just PR. The president is trying to manage the war in a way that makes him look good. And indeed, as you said, like the poll keeps moving because he keeps changing the goals depending on what he thinks are achievable goals and therefore would make him victorious. So I think that's the reasoning behind it. It's not coercive diplomacy as much as managing the expectations of the people that support him and more importantly, controlling and manipulating the narrative, which is something that President Trump has been very good at, trying to make failures look like successes.
Now, on this point of sort of dominating or controlling the narrative, after the attack on the bridge in Iran, we saw that Iran had released claims saying that they shot down F-35, an F-15, and a A-10 or A-13 Warthog. How do these competing narratives sort of shape this conflict? And at one point, does propaganda become truth and propaganda is a lie? What are the lines here exactly?
I actually believe that the propaganda becomes less effective the longer it takes. People are getting killed. The situation is not improving. So there is no wordsmithing or painting over the ugliness of what's happening. So it's just trying to manage the picture, like the perception of the regime to its own people, and the U.S. also managing its own its perception by its own people. It's a tactic, but it's not really the driver of the war. I would only say that the longer the war, the more you're going to have these either success of the Iranians in hitting American planes and assets, or just sheer exhaustion and fatigue of the personnel that are flying those planes that cause mistakes. So mistakes are going to happen. The longer the war happens, the longer the war extends.
Now, Professor, if Iran is capable of shooting down these jets, if these claims are realistic and true, what does this tell us and what does this mean for the sort of balance of power between these two parties?
What we've seen is that indeed the Iranian regime is good at learning quickly the means and methods of the other side and learning on the fly. So after a month of war with the Americans, there is evidence that they've been probing and they've been testing through sending swarms of drones or making certain attacks. So now they have a better sense of of how the U.S. operates in the war theater, but also what the vulnerabilities are. So they are now better at preparing, ambushing the American attacks and at increasing the chances of their weapon systems succeeding in hitting American targets. So there is a definitely disadvantage for the Iranians in that they are learning on the ground while the Americans aren't.
Now, Professor, how likely does this conflict expand and bring in, let's say, regional militias or other states into this Middle East conflict? What would that look like, and how would this turn into a broader war? Sort of, these are the fears that people are having today.
So there are two things that could happen. One is one of the countries, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Pakistan, has a serious problem. Like, for example, the Kurds in northern Iran are supported by Israel and the U.S., and they start attacking. Turkey is not going to be silent on that. Or maybe if Iran itself starts provoking the Kurds in Turkey, that causes problems. So anything, or Azerbaijan for that matter, anything that is going to seriously threaten the national interest of the neighbor countries, that's going to involve more people. The other is, what could happen is that the cost to China, to India, to some key international players becomes too high, that they start putting pressure on all sides to end the war, because their interests are getting undermined to a large extent.
Professor, can you just share with us what does this mean for key trade routes and energy routes? If we're looking at a prolonged conflict and a prolonged disruption to these routes, what does this mean to the global outlook?
We're seeing that already there is a reorientation of the global energy market. Here in the US now there is a big drive for coal again. India as well, India and China are going back to coal. Definitely the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz is going to be of less importance. People and companies are gonna stay away or have more contingencies. And for that matter, also Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea, and of course the Suez Canal. So the whole region has now, unfortunately, earned a bad reputation of being dangerous, and so the companies are either going to change their routes or actually change the way they get their energy.
Now, Professor, we've seen the World Food Programme is warning this could push tens of millions of people into acute hunger and malnutrition. Can you explain the link between the conflict here in the Middle East and the impact it will have on global food insecurity?
Indeed, that's something that a lot of people misconstrued or miscalculated in that we are still living in a globalized world where trade flows freely from all countries, and hence the dependencies. So apparently, a lot of the fertilizing or production of fertilizers depends on petroleum products for the production. So now a lot of arable land that was supposed to be cultivated does not have the kinds of fertilizers they need. Some countries depend a lot on, or to a large extent, on energy, whether gas or oil, that's coming from the Gulf, and that has had devastating effects on their economies, right? So the connection is that the world economy is connected through these chains, supply chains, and those, let's say, one-point failure points that have devastating effects on, unfortunately, the more vulnerable groups in the world.
Professor, if we see the price of oil go beyond 100, with some estimates putting up to 150, even others putting as high as $200, how long until we start feeling the real economic hurt from these prices?
It's hard to say, but what's definitely going to happen is that it's going to cause shifts in economies, in how different countries use energy and what their priorities are. But also, and that's another problem that people, the longer the war continues, is that those oil fields and gas fields that are shut down, it takes longer to put them back put them back on. So even if the war ends today, it's going to take months, if not years, to go back to the normal or pre-war levels of gas and oil supplies. So that is going to be a problem that's going to be with us for years to come, for sure. And the longer this war, let's say every day this war extends, where the ramifications are gonna extend for more years.
Professor, are there any realistic off-ramps or exit strategies to this crisis? Many people thought that when Trump gave his address to the nation just a few days ago, that he would simply declare victory and walk away. But even this victory that he would declare, what does this victory look like to the U.S.?
Well, in this case, actually, there is some optimism in that it shouldn't take much to have some scenario, some event look like a victory for Trump. So the fact that he said that Hormuz is not a priority for the US, it's a priority for other countries, is one way in which Trump is signaling that he's achieved his goals and what's left are not things that are US priorities. And that would give him an off-ramp in a sense. However, it hasn't been that good of an off-ramp, and I think he's looking for some sort of big attack, some sort of images of big destruction or special forces mission that really looks good, the way the abducting Maduro in Venezuela was. Some things that's going to make him look very much in control, and that gives him some ammunition to claim that he has had victory. And on the Iranian side, all they need is just to survive. If the regime survives, that's a victory for them. So again, that's an easy win. That's easy to achieve. The key is to get something that Trump considers is good enough to look like a victory.
Now, Professor, before we end this segment, I'd just like to ask you this final question. If this continues on its current trajectory, where do you think we'll be in another month? Will we be in containment? Is this going to become a wider regional war, or something even larger than that?
I actually suspect that it's just going to go to a different phase, a low-intensity warfare where you do not have daily attacks, but you also have the Americans and the Israelis keep the pressure on Iran or the Iranian regime through different means, through having commando attacks every week or two, while at the same time coming to an understanding with the Iranians on a certain level of flow of gas and oil to calm the markets. So I could see both sides accepting a less than favorable status quo of almost war or not just war.
Well, Professor Nizar Farsakh, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights about the ongoing crisis and your expectations in the coming days and weeks.